is shining, in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us, set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me, shine on me, shine, Jesus, shine, fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning. Thanks for joining me. I'm Dave Grant, host of Let the Bible Speak. I hope you'll get your Bible out so you can read along with me. We're going to be limiting the number of scriptures we're going to look at today, but we're going to conclude our thoughts on accountability and consequences. Last week we looked at what is accountability, and today we're going to spend a little bit more time on consequences. It's important that we understand the difference, and the Bible actually spells it out for us. A lot of times if people suffer, they say, why is God causing me to suffer? So let's take a look at where that suffering really comes from. Suffering is always associated with sin, but it may not be that you're accountable for the sin that you're suffering for. Someone else may be accountable for it. So we're going to turn to Ezekiel chapter 18, where he provides some insight. Now, this is God's message to Ezekiel the prophet, and he told the people what God said. So he was like a preacher, a prophet, who would explain that this is how God feels about this, and he wants you to do this. Often the prophets would warn the people that they were sinning, and God was going to punish them for that sin, consequences. So let's take a look first at the opening of Ezekiel chapter 18. Now, Ezekiel is past the Psalms and Proverbs. And Psalms is about in the middle of your Bible. So you'll go to Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel. Ezekiel is one of the larger books in the Old Testament. Excuse me just a minute. So in chapter 18, to give you some context here, it's important that we realize that this is the nation of Israel that God is actually talking to. So when he sent a prophet to Jerusalem to specifically address the tribe of Judah, which is where the kings were from, and also Jesus Christ was born in the line or the ancestry of Judah. But then the northern tribes, there were 10 northern tribes, and they had prophets as well, and God would speak to them and cause them to take a second look at what you're doing. You're sinning. And so all of these prophets are giving messages from God. As I've held to for many, many years, the Bible has one author, and that's God. He has many people who wrote down his messages throughout time. Ezekiel didn't write everything for all time, but rather he wrote at a specific time in history. So when we look at Ezekiel 18, right in the beginning, this is how God starts his message. The word of the Lord came to me, which me is Ezekiel, and this is the word of the Lord. What do you mean by repeating this proverb concerning the land of Israel? And this is a quote from God. The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth are set on edge. As I live, declares the Lord, this proverb shall no more be used by you in Israel. Behold, all souls are mine. Now, get this. This is the important introduction here. All souls are mine. They belong to the Lord. The Father, the soul of the Father, as well as the soul of the Son. The soul who sins shall die. So God's kind of giving us a preamble of what he's going to be discussing and explaining in Ezekiel 18. The, the people of Israel had this wise saying, this what they considered to be a truth, is that when the fathers eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. In other words, what dad does is automatically going to be passed on to the son. They saw if dad was a thief, you couldn't trust the son, he was a thief too. Eating sour grapes, I don't know if you've ever eaten a sour grape, but it's tart and it causes you to wake up, and I can even feel it, that my teeth are responding in a negative way when I eat a sour grape. So if the dad eats sour grapes, it affects the son as well. But he says, the soul that sins is the soul that dies. In other words, don't condemn the son because the dad was bad. Interesting, isn't it? Now, he goes into great detail in this chapter, but that is what God is addressing in this book. He wants the people to know that each man in this case, and since we're talking about mankind, each man and woman are responsible to God on their own. They are accountable to God on their own. And so the son or the daughter has to stand before God for their own sin, not for their father or mother's sin. Now, I have used this passage many, many times when someone says, well, what about original sin? Now, listen carefully to this part. There is an original sin. When Adam and Eve chose to disobey God and eat the fruit of the tree that they were forbidden to eat from, they chose to sin. Now, that's the original sin. But after that, anytime anyone chose to do something that was contrary to what God wanted them to do, it was sin. So if I look at this preamble to Ezekiel 18, I see that God says, okay, Adam and Eve sinned, and they are accountable for that. But what about the son? So we've got Cain, Abel, and Seth. Are they held accountable for that sin? Is that original sin stamped on their soul? Nowhere in the Bible does it say that, but rather it says just the opposite. The soul that sins is the soul that dies. Now, people have asked me many, many times about original sin. In other words, we're born with the sin stamp on our soul. That's not true. We are born innocent. We are standing before God on our own account for what we choose to do. Now, in the initial years, you can't really make choices without knowledge, without the ability to have complex thinking. And complex might be a little bit big of a word as far as the degree of it. But if you can't make decisions for yourself, then you are not held accountable for decisions because you're not making decisions. Other people are making those decisions for you. So, my grandson is 2. He will be 3 soon. He is still learning and developing. His brain isn't even fully developed. His body isn't fully developed. So his parents are responsible to make the decisions for him. And they try to keep him safe. They try to keep him healthy and well and happy. But they have to make those decisions because he doesn't know anything about the world or what the animals do. He's learning. He can make animal sounds, and I just love it. But he's not responsible for his sin because he hasn't sinned. He hasn't made that choice on his own. So the sins of his father are not stamped on his soul, just like the sins of Adam and Eve are not stamped on anyone's soul. What it did is it opened the gate to where Satan could tempt us. And we all get to choose whether or not we sin against our God. And as you can see, God has very clearly said from the beginning, he said it to Adam and Eve, and he says it to the people of Ezekiel's time, and he also says it to us through Jesus in the New Testament. The soul that sins is the soul that dies. Now that's talking about accountability. And we looked at that some last week. In fact, who's accountable? We looked at Proverbs. Train a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, that is a wise saying that we need to do our part while we have the ability to make their decisions for them. But at some point, we all know that a child reaches the age where they become accountable for their own decisions. They make decisions to disobey on their own. And when they do, they are held accountable for it. Today, we want to look more at the consequences, because sin does have consequences, and not just to the one who sins. Accountability is only held against the one who chooses to do what is wrong. The consequences can be widespread and affect a lot of people. And if you are following closely with what I'm saying, you realize that can be true. If someone takes a plane and drives it into the towers in New York City, guess what's going to happen? Many people are going to die. There are consequences that everyone's going to have based upon that. I'm suffering consequences of that act. Even today, if I want to go on an airplane, I have a heightened level of security, which I appreciate, because I want someone to be sure there's nobody going to blow anything up. So think about that for a second. Consequences are widespread and long-lasting, but the accountability for that sin can only be the person who chose to do it. I will not be held accountable for that sin. I go through things. Think about the families that lost a loved one that day. Think about the families that lost a loved one. Are they suffering consequences? Yes, and they will have those consequences through their life. But they did not make any decision to sin, so they're not accountable for it. God isn't holding them responsible for that sin. My promotion or advertising, the commercial that I had on this week prior to this show was, if someone pushed you off a building, you would not be held accountable for the sin of pushing someone off a building, but you'll suffer the consequences when you hit the ground. That's just the way it is. And that kind of thinking, we've got to start adopting as our worldview, rather than what people are saying. Well, why is God doing this? Why is God punishing me? Where is God when I need him? There are so many human reasoning that it takes the truth out of the picture. It clouds the truth. The truth is, if you choose to sin, you're going to suffer, because you're going to be held accountable for that. But if you are suffering, but it wasn't because of your sin, it's not God's fault. Sin is actually going to cause others to suffer. Let me think about this for a second. If I choose to do something wrong, sin, and it hurts my family, they are going to have to suffer the consequences of that. And they will not be held accountable. I hope that's clear enough. That's basically what Ezekiel 18 is teaching us. So let me look at my notes to make sure I haven't forgotten anything. The consequences of sin may cause innocents to suffer, but the innocents are not held accountable. They remain innocent. Now, I'm going to take a short break, and I just want to offer you our Bible course. The next few screens you're going to see have the Bible course, the Bible that we offer free of charge, our address and phone number. So I hope you'll take a moment to write that down, and I'll be back in just a jiffy. Now, let's look at Ezekiel 18, verse 5. Um, if a man is righteous and does what is just and right, if he does not eat upon the mountains, which was a reference to sacrificing to idols, or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, does not defile his neighbor's wife or approach a woman in her time of menstrual impurity, does not oppress anyone, but restores to the debtor his pledge, commits no robbery, gives his bread to the hungry, and covers the naked with a garment, does not lend at interest or take any profit, withholds his hand from injustice, executes true justice between man and man, walks in my statutes, and keeps my rules by acting faithfully, he is righteous. He shall surely live, declares the Lord. Now let's stop there for a minute. That was quite a chunk to bite off there. A lot of the description does not defile neighbor's wife, does not oppress anyone, doesn't charge interest to a brother. Those were all examples of keeping God's statutes or God's law. What it is doing what is right. Now, God gets to decide what the law is because he's the one who created us. So it's quite clear from this that if you want to do what is right and you want to follow God, you're going to be considered righteous. Now, this is the Old Testament, and it's the Old Covenant, so they're following the law of Moses, which was given on Mount Sinai. Excuse me just a moment. So when I look at that, I realize, okay, so he's just kind of giving examples of what righteousness is. It's doing what is right. And he shall surely live. In other words, go back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. God said, if you eat the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And yet they lived hundreds of years later. He wasn't talking necessarily, although it's tied into it, he wasn't talking that they would just be struck down dead right then. Because God doesn't want his creation to suffer. He doesn't want to obliterate them. He doesn't want to cast them out. So he provided a redemption, and he told them about it. That he didn't use the name Jesus the Christ, but it was through Jesus that we were offered that redemption. And Adam and Eve could receive that redemption through Jesus by having the sins committed beforehand forgiven. Now, I'm not trying to confuse the issue, but their sin caused death. It caused a spiritual death or a separation from God that could only be renewed through the blood of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. They also suffered physical death, not immediate, but at some point. Just as today, when I sin, God doesn't strike me dead. But he says, your sin, for that sin you will surely die, means that at my death, if I'm still separated from God, I have no hope of living with him for eternity. So sin needs to be dealt with. And God is so patient and loving, he doesn't want me to die for my sin, even though I did sin. He wants me to live righteously because in his world, and we call it heaven, in his world, there is only righteousness. We're not going to be choosing to do what is wrong. That old order of things is gone. So I want to be right with him when I physically die so that I can spiritually live with him forever. So when God says he is righteous, he shall surely live. He's talking about when he dies, he will live for eternity because he's righteous. He's following God's law, his rules. Now, let's go on to verse 10. If he fathers a son who is violent, remember, the man is righteous, but he fathers a son who is violent, a shedder of blood, who does any of these things, though he himself did none of these things, who even eats upon the mountains, defiles his neighbor's wife, oppresses the poor and needy, commits robbery, does not restore the pledge, lifts up his eyes to the idols, commits abomination, lends at interest, and takes profit, shall he then live? He shall not live. He has done all these abominations. He shall surely die. His blood shall be upon himself. Okay, you got the man. He's living righteously, and he will live eternally with God because he is righteous. He has a son. The son is not righteous. He does everything the opposite of what the righteous man does. He shall not live. He will surely die. And his blood is not on dad. But dad's righteousness doesn't carry over to him either. He gets to choose for himself. Just like every one of us, myself, my children, my grandchildren, you, your children, we all stand before God on our own, making our own decisions, choosing to do what is right or choosing to do what is wrong. Now, we'll go on. Now, suppose this man, I'm in verse 14, if you're following along. Now, suppose this man fathers a son who sees all the sins that his father has done. He sees and does not do likewise. He does not eat upon the mountains or lift up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel, does not defile his neighbor's wife, does not oppress anyone, exacts no pledge, commits no robbery, but gives his bread to the hungry. I got to find my place. And covers the naked with a garment, withholds his hand from iniquity, takes no interest or profit, obeys my rules and walks in my statutes, he shall not die for his father's iniquity or his father's sin. He shall surely live. As for his father, because he practiced extortion, robbed his brother, and did what is not good among his people, behold, he shall die for his iniquity. So he's gone this way, that way. Now he's going back this way. If dad is good and he raises a son who chooses to do evil, the son dies for his sin, the man lives. If a dad is bad, evil, but he raises a son who chooses to do what is righteous, the son shall live, the dad shall die. It doesn't go back and forth. So how in the world can I be held accountable for the sin of Adam and Eve? I can't, but I can suffer the consequences. Sin is now in the world, and I have to decide for myself whether or not I choose to do it. That is the whole original sin idea is false. God says, I don't want you thinking this way anymore. It doesn't let you off the hook. You still have to decide for yourself. The idea of being held accountable for someone else's sin is ludicrous in God's sight. And that's why he's going to such lengths to explain it to us. I need to stand up and take responsibility for my own choices of whether I do what is right or whether I do what is wrong. And you might say, well, my mom and dad didn't teach me right. They didn't do, well, yeah, you could whine all day. But ultimately, he gives us his word. He allows us to read the Bible. He allows us to study together, to go to church, to learn more about it, so we can learn how to be righteous and make our choices to please God rather than not. Where did I leave off? I read 14 through 18. Now let's look at verse 19. And God does this several times with the prophets. He tells them something, and they tell the people, and then he says, well, I can hear what you are wanting to say to me because of that. So he says in verse 19, as though they are speaking back to him, yet you say, why should not the Son suffer for the sin or iniquity of the Father? Why shouldn't the Son suffer? When the Son has done what is just and right, and has been careful to observe all my statutes, he shall surely live. That's just the way it is. God is not going to hold you accountable for someone else's sin. The soul who sins shall die. The Son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the Father, nor the Father suffer for the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Now, don't forget, if dad is an evil person, you're probably going to live a life that will have consequences of his life. Consequences are not going to keep you from eternal life. You may suffer your whole life for the sins of someone else, but you have been set free by Jesus Christ for your sin so you can live eternally. I think that's a wonderful choice. But the problem is you can't say, well, I didn't get a chance. No, we all have a chance. God has made himself known, and he's also asked many of us to be responsible to share that message with you. Now, I've run out of time for today, but I want to clean this up next week by reminding everyone accountability only goes to the one who chooses to do what is wrong. Make this week the week you choose to do what is right. Thanks for being with me, and God bless.
The Father's glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord.